I wanted to finish off just briefly with Russian art and culture, just to cover a few more ideas. We talked about last time the development of art as Russia was seeking to modernize and to unify its country under this umbrella of nationalism to form an identity and to reshape their culture and this new form of political and economic system of communism. We see Stalin really taking the reins of the art world. And so it's kind of interesting if we think about that, just kind of stepping back about why the government seems to have an interest within art. Why would someone like Stalin, or as we're going to see with Hitler in Germany, have such an interest in forms of art that they want to censor, that they want to create a certain style, a certain look? And as we see here, I had you think about in the last lecture the difference between how Stalin wanted to portray Lenin and how he wanted to portray himself, and to think about why those differences might exist or what kind of feelings are evoked within this, right? So just a couple images that we looked at before that shows, both of them kind of stately, both of them looking off into the distance, looking up, kind of upward and onward, but still kind of yet different, a different kind of theme, a different kind of mood. And down here it says, Stalin is our banner, right? And so it's kind of interesting as they're kind of commemorating and memorializing the political leaders, what they're choosing to emphasize and the imagery that they're trying to evoke. And as we take a look at this, the first knee jerk reaction is, well, this is just dictators that are wanting to control all power. But in some ways, if we kind of step back from this, all nations kind of do this. All nations try to control the narrative of their heritage, control the narrative of their history. And in the United States, we focus on founding fathers, right? These are the pillars of the United States that shaped our government. And so we can see to some extent that we do that in the United States as well, as we create monuments to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Lincoln as he comes later. That these are the pillars of the people that we look to for admiration, and the Soviet Union is doing the same thing now. There's kind of some interesting different levels, different dimensions that we can see within the Soviet art. Stalin mainly was, I mean, he was a dictator and mainly used a lot of political threats and sending people that did not agree with him to gulags, which were slave labor camps in Siberia. So the effect of what they were doing is different, right? So what they're trying to cover up, some of the truth that they were trying to cover up is certainly different. But to some extent, the idea of using art to portray a certain image is not necessarily something new. And we talked about before the kind of the Lenin kind of initial art of the Soviet Union with the advent of communism versus Stalin art is very different, right? This one's more abstract versus this one's very concrete and easy to understand. And so, what I want you to get out of this is to think about why this would be something that would appeal to kind of early on with Lenin. What are they trying to do? How is this kind of a symbol of what the message of communism is seeking to do with its use of abstraction rather than the concrete? And then Stalin decides to change it, since we see kind of the changing of the guard, the changing of the government, the changing of methodology within the Soviet Union as we see his different styles. And so, in addition to how we see the differences in their portrayal, we see differences in the style of art as well between when Lenin was leading and when Stalin was in charge. And again, to think about why is it so important for these governments to have this rigid censorship on controlling the means of art. And so we see that particularly with Stalin, that he wanted to have a unified style, no individuality. It was to represent the common workers, to glorify them, to glorify the government, to be easy to understand, to be realistic. And again, to think about why do you think that he wanted this kind of uniform style that was focusing on easy to understand, whereas, trying to get away from this more avant-garde kind of more kind of newer form of art that most of the rest of the world is kind of more moving towards doing something different with art. Stalin sees kind of a return to tradition. And so I want you to think about why do you think Stalin would do that, have such strict regulations? And the strict regulations just wasn't on visual art, it also extended to film, it extended to music, and it certainly extended to literature. And the whole idea was they wanted to control the messaging. And as we think about that, we think, okay, that seems typical for dictatorships. But again, we have to have that critical lens and think, is our society, our country, does our country censor the kind of arts, the art forms that we have, right? And before with a knee-jerk reaction is no, that's absurd, kind of think a little bit deeper about that. Really, I kind of delve into to see if there is censorship, if there are books that are banned or films that are banned. Kind of look a little bit deeper and take a closer look at our own culture. It's good to have that critical eye. It's easy to be dismissive of other cultures that are different from us, but it's a lot more challenging for us to take that critical lens that we use as we examine other cultures and apply it to ourselves with a critical lens. And so I'm going to challenge you to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about how the United States has its own form of censorship that we'll examine. Uh, I want to take a look at just one poem of a Soviet writer, Yevtushenko, and it's kind of interesting how he is portraying the idea of heroism and courage. And so he was given a little bit more freedom as a writer to be critical. He was writing under, Khrushchev, what is called the Khrushchev Thaw, uh, which which uh, which kind of loosened the regulations on the art world. And so he was able to have a slightly more critical lens than Stalin would permit. And he talks about this idea of what courage is. And I wanted to just read through this quickly, and then you can apply these ideas to the other poem that I wanted you to read. And here's what he says. He says, "You have courage, they tell me. It's not true. I was never courageous. I simply felt it unbecoming to stoop to the cowardice of my colleagues. I've shaken no foundations." And so, kind of interesting here, he's arguing that people think that he's courageous for speaking out to defy Stalin, which if you did defy Stalin, you could end up in a gulag. And so, people that broke from the censorship, that broke from artists that didn't follow the set standards, were politically exiled, or they were arrested, and he's suggesting that breaking against that, right, going against Stalin, although people say it's courageous, maybe it's not, right? So it's kind of a different idea. He says, "I simply mocked at pretense and inflation, wrote articles, scribbled no denunciations. I tried to speak all on my mind. Yes, I defended men of talent, branding the hacks, the would-be writers. But this in general, we should always do. And yet they keep stressing my courage. Oh, the descendants will burn with bitter shame to remember when punishing vile acts that most peculiar time when plain honesty was labeled courage." And so he's suggesting that it's kind of a weird world that we live in when speaking your mind and speaking, more importantly, the truth is labeled as courageous, because he's suggesting that shouldn't be courage, that should be the norm. And so he's examining how we need to push against extremism. We need to push against the idea of censorship, and we need to be able to have the freedom to speak honestly, to speak truthfully against those that are in power, against those that are trying to silence. And so it's kind of an interesting idea. Is that necessarily courage? In some ways, yes, it is, because the opposite of that would be confinement or imprisonment, but it shouldn't be. So he's suggesting that we need to be careful of our society and be critical of our societies, so we don't get to that point of ultra extremism where we're trying to denounce or trying to repress the truth. And so it's, again, that's something to think about as we think about what is art and what is propaganda, right? What is propaganda seeking to do in general? A lot of times, I mean, although some propaganda can be truthful, a lot of propaganda can be false, right? So as we take a look at the differences between Stalinist art and propaganda, we can take a look at how much truth is Stalin's art, and I use that term loosely, portraying truth. How closely is it portraying reality, or is it portraying something that is something that's different from reality, an alternate reality? And so, again, something to think about as we think about what is art and what is propaganda, how closely it imitates or it reflects or it speaks truth, and that's something that we need to consider as we move on.